They called her the ghost, Alara. A name whispered like a curl of smoke, there and gone. She was the omega of the Blackwood pack, the lowest of the low, a creature of utility and nothing more. Her existence was measured in chores completed and punishments endured. Today, it was measured by the biting cold. The wind was a blade against her exposed skin. It sliced through the threadbare wool of her tunic, a garment more whole than fabric, and sank its teeth deep into her bones. Each gust was a fresh assault, stealing what little warmth her shivering body could generate. Her fingers, raw and red, were clumsy as they scrubbed at the frozen grime on the steps of the Alpha's lodge. The water in her bucket had a skin of ice she had to break with her knuckles every few moments. Pain was a constant companion, a dull ache that lived behind her eyes and in the marrow of her bones. She was an orphan, a stray pup taken in not from kindness, but from a grudging sense of duty that had long since curdled into resentment. Her parents had been traitors, they said. They had challenged the old Alpha and paid the price. She was their living shame, a reminder of dissent, and the pack never let her forget it. She was worthless, a stain on their honor. They told her this every day, with their words, with their fists, with the scraps of food they tossed her way as if feeding a dog. A shadow fell over her. Alara didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of cloying floral perfume and smug superiority was unmistakable. Lyra, the Alpha's daughter. "Still scrubbing, Ghost?" Lyra's voice was like honey laced with shards of glass. "You missed a spot." A polished boot kicked the wooden bucket. Icy water sloshed over the side, splashing onto Alara's legs and instantly freezing to her thin trousers. The shock of it was so intense it stole her breath. It felt like being burned and frozen all at once. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out, the coppery taste of blood a familiar tang on her tongue. "Clumsy thing," Lyra tisked, though her smile was sharp and cruel. She was flanked by 2 other she-wolves who giggled, their laughter like the chipping of ice. "My father wants these steps clean enough to see his reflection in before the midday meal. You'd better hurry. Or perhaps you'd prefer to skip another meal?" Alara kept her eyes down, her gaze fixed on the dark, wet patch of wood. To look up was to invite more trouble. To speak was to beg for a slap. Silence and invisibility were her only shields, however thin they might be. "What's the matter, Ghost? Cat got your tongue?" Lyra nudged her shoulder with the toe of her boot. It wasn't a hard push, but it was degrading. It was a reminder of her place, less than the dirt she was tasked to clean. She just shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Her world had shrunk to this single, frozen step, this bucket of icy water, this hollow ache in her stomach. She focused on the task, on the rhythmic scrape of the brush against the wood. It was all she had. If she could just finish this, she could retreat to the sliver of hay in the back of the kitchens that served as her bed. She could curl into a tight ball and pretend she didn't exist. Lyra and her friends eventually grew bored. Their amusement required a reaction, and Alara had learned long ago to give them none. With a final sniff of disdain, they swept back into the warmth of the lodge, leaving her alone once more with the biting wind and the impossible task. She gritted her teeth, the sound a harsh rasp in the frozen air. They could kick her, they could starve her, they could call her worthless until the skies fell, but they couldn't break the thing deep inside her. It was a tiny, stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished. It was the part of her that remembered her mother's smile, a vague and hazy memory, but one that held a whisper of warmth. It was the part of her that stubbornly drew breath after breath, day after agonizing day. They had not broken her. Not yet. She dipped the brush back into the freezing water and continued to scrub. The sky began to change. The pale gray of the winter morning deepened into an ominous, bruised purple. The wind, already cruel, picked up a new, keening howl that vibrated through the ground. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding torrent. It was sudden, unnatural, a blizzard descending like a shroud. Alarms began to sound within the pack lodge, a deep, resonant horn calling everyone to the safety of the main hall. The pack would be warm. They would be safe. They would have food. Alara was forgotten, as always. No, not forgotten. She was given one last task. Gorak, one of the pack's lead enforcers and a brutish male who followed Lyra around like a loyal hound, stomped out onto the porch. He didn't even look at her, just pointed a thick finger toward the outer perimeter. "The storm gate's on the north fence. The wind is tearing them from their hinges. Go secure them." It was a death sentence. The north fence was a half-mile trek through the heart of the burgeoning storm. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her practiced numbness. "But the storm," she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse and cold. Gorak's eyes, small and mean, finally fixed on her. "Did I ask for your opinion, Omega? Go, or don't bother coming back at all." He turned and disappeared back into the lodge, the heavy door slamming shut behind him with a sound of absolute finality. She was left alone in the swirling vortex of white. The choice wasn't a choice at all. To stay was to freeze on the Alpha's doorstep. To go was to risk being lost in the storm. At least going offered a sliver of a chance. That stubborn ember inside her flickered. It chose to fight. Pulling her thin cloak tighter, a useless gesture against the raging gale, Alara pushed herself to her feet. Her legs were stiff and numb, but she forced them to move. She stumbled down the steps and into the blizzard. Within seconds, the lodge was swallowed by the snow. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The wind was a physical force, shoving and tearing at her. Snow clogged her vision, plastered her eyelashes, and filled her mouth when she gasped for breath. Every direction looked the same, a chaotic, churning wall of white. The path to the north fence was gone, buried. She was navigating by memory and instinct, but the storm was a disorienting monster. It twisted the landscape, muffling sound and stealing all sense of direction. Fear was a cold knot in her gut, tighter and more painful than the hunger. She was going to die out here. Her life, a miserable half-existence of servitude and pain, was going to end in a nameless snowdrift. The thought was met not with terror, but with a wave of profound, weary sadness. Was this all she was ever meant to be? A ghost who faded into the white? Her foot caught on an unseen root, and she pitched forward, landing hard in a deep drift. The snow was a suffocating blanket, cold and heavy. For a moment, she just lay there. It would be so easy to close her eyes, so easy to let the cold take her, to finally sleep without the promise of waking to more pain. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. It was that flicker of defiance, that tiny, stubborn ember. She would not die like this. She would not give them the satisfaction. With a surge of desperate strength, she clawed her way out of the drift, gasping and shivering. She was lost, completely and utterly lost. The north fence was an impossible goal. Now, survival was the only thing that mattered. She needed shelter. A cave, an overhang, anything to get out of the wind. She stumbled on, driven by pure instinct. The world was a blur of white and the howl of the wind. She didn't know how long she walked. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the next step and the next. Her body was shutting down. The shivering had started to subside, replaced by a dangerous, creeping numbness. Her thoughts grew sluggish. Then she saw it. A dark shape against the white, a shadow in the storm, a rock face, and at its base a darker slash, the mouth of a cave. Hope, fierce and painful, surged through her. With the last of her strength, she staggered toward it, falling to her knees at the entrance and crawling inside. The relative quiet within the cave was deafening after the roar of the storm. The wind still echoed at the entrance, but its claws could no longer reach her. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and something else, something wild and musky, and something metallic and sharp. Blood. Her eyes, slowly adjusting to the gloom, found the source. In the back of the small cave lay a wolf. It was enormous, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, with a coat the color of midnight. It was also grievously injured. Its flank was matted with blood from a deep, ragged wound, and its breathing was shallow and labored. It was dying. Fear warred with a strange, compelling empathy. This creature was a predator, a monster of the forest. Her pack had taught her to fear and hate lone wolves. But looking at it now, seeing its pain, she felt no fear, only a profound sense of kinship. It was hurt. It was alone, just like her. She crept closer. The wolf didn't stir, save for the faint rise and fall of its ribs. The scent of its blood was thick in the air. Without thinking, she shrugged off her threadbare cloak. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Tearing a strip from the hem, she gently, tentatively, pressed the fabric against the worst of the wound. A low growl rumbled in the wolf's chest, a sound like distant thunder. Its massive head lifted slightly, and two eyes opened, fixing on her. They were not the eyes of a simple animal. They were intelligent, ancient, and they glowed with a faint inner light, the color of molten gold. Alara froze, her hand still pressed to its side. She expected it to lash out, to rip her apart for her audacity. Instead, after a long, assessing moment, the great head sank back down. It was a gesture of acceptance? Or perhaps just exhaustion. She took it as permission. She spent the next hour tending to the great beast. She used strips of her cloak to clean and bind the wound as best she could. When the bleeding had slowed, she saw that it was shivering, its powerful body racked with tremors. The cold was killing it as surely as the wound. Hesitantly, she lay down beside it, curling her small, frail body against its massive one. The fur was thick, but it offered no warmth. The wolf was cold, its life fading. She pressed closer, trying to share what little body heat she had left. It felt like a fool's errand, a candle trying to warm a glacier. She was an omega, worthless and weak. What could she possibly offer a creature like this? But she stayed. She whispered to it, soft, nonsensical things, the way her mother might have whispered to her. She told it about the storm, about her pack, about the cold. She poured out all her quiet misery into the darkness of the cave, her words a soft murmur against the wolf's dark fur. She didn't know why. She just knew she couldn't let it die alone. She must have drifted off, lulled into a state of semi-consciousness by exhaustion and cold. She was dreaming of warmth, of a fire roaring in a hearth, when a strange heat bloomed beneath her hand, the one still resting on the wolf's flank. It wasn't the heat of a fever, it was something else, pure, powerful. Her hand tingled, and a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. It was not painful. It was a connection, a live wire humming between them. She gasped, her eyes flying open. The cave was filled with a soft, silvery light, and it was coming from her hand. The light pulsed, and a searing heat erupted on the back of her wrist. This time, it was pain, sharp and clean, like a brand being pressed to her skin. She cried out, pulling her hand back as if burned. The silvery light vanished, plunging the cave back into darkness. But the pain remained, a fiery throbbing in her wrist. In the gloom, she could just make out a new shape on her skin. It was a mark, intricate and glowing with a faint residual light. A stylized wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl at a crescent moon. It was beautiful and terrifying. What was happening to me? A deep groan came from beside her. The great wolf was stirring. It pushed itself up, its movements no longer weak and halting, but filled with a nascent power. And then, in the shadows, it began to change. Bones cracked and reformed. Fur receded. The lupine form melted away, replaced by the lines and planes of a man. He was huge, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, his body a tapestry of muscle and old scars. He was naked, seemingly oblivious to the cold. As he rose to his full, towering height, his head nearly brushed the roof of the cave. Alara scrambled backward, crab-walking until her back hit the cold stone wall of the cave. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of pure terror. This was not a wolf. This was a shifter, a powerful one. And she was trapped in a cave with him. He turned his head, and his eyes found her in the dark. They were the same eyes. Not wolf, not human, but something more. They glowed with that same molten gold, pinning her in place. His gaze dropped from her face to her wrist, where the new mark was still pulsing with a faint silver light. A low sound rumbled in his chest, the human equivalent of the growl she had heard before. It was possessive, final. He took a step toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. She was a mouse, and a lion had just entered her cage. He stopped just before her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He lifted a hand, his fingers long and calloused, and gently, so gently it was a shock, he touched the mark on her wrist. The same electric jolt shot through her, but this time it was followed by a wave of warmth, of rightness, of peace. It was the most confusing sensation of her life. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep, rough with disuse, and resonated to the very core of her being. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, an ancient truth finally spoken aloud. Mine. The word shattered her terror and replaced it with a profound, soul-deep confusion. Her body, her very instincts, relaxed at the sound of his voice, at his touch. Some primal part of her recognized him, yearned for him, felt safe with him. But her mind, the mind of Alara the Omega, the worthless ghost, screamed that this was impossible. She tried to speak, to ask who he was, what was happening, but only a choked squeak escaped her lips. He was the Alpha King. She did not know this. She only knew he was more powerful than anyone she had ever met. He was a force of nature, and he had just laid claim to her. And he did not correct her ignorance. In that moment, to her, he was just the wounded stranger she had saved. He didn't press her for an answer. He simply knelt before her, his golden gaze never leaving hers. He took her small, cold hand in his large, warm one, his thumb stroking the glowing brand on her wrist. The gesture was so tender, so at odds with his fierce appearance, that it brought tears to her eyes. No one had ever touched her with such care. "You're cold," he stated, his voice softer now. He shifted, moving to sit beside her, his back against the cave wall. Then he drew her against his side. The heat from his skin was incredible, a living furnace that chased away the bone-deep chill she had carried for years. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close until her head rested on his shoulder. She should have fought. She should have been terrified, part of her was. But the overwhelming sense of safety, of belonging, was a drug she had been denied her entire life. For the first time, she wasn't cold. She wasn't alone. She let out a shuddering breath and, against all reason, she relaxed against him. The storm howled outside, but in the cave, held against the side of this powerful, dangerous stranger, she felt the first stirrings of a fragile, impossible hope. She woke to the sound of voices. Not the deep rumble of the man beside her, but harsher, familiar tones that sent a spike of ice through her veins. She was still pressed against him, his arm a heavy, protective weight around her. The storm had broken, and pale morning light filtered into the cave entrance. Standing there, silhouetted against the snow, were two figures, Lyra and Garrock. "There she is," Lyra sneered, her eyes taking in the scene with unconcealed disgust and jealousy. "The little stray, shacked up with some brute." Garrock's gaze was sharper. He wasn't looking at the man's impressive physique, but at Alara's wrist, still loosely held in the stranger's hand. The mark was no longer glowing, but it was starkly visible against her pale skin, a complex silver tattoo. His eyes widened, a flicker of avarice and ambition in their depths. He didn't recognize the man, but he recognized the significance of a claiming mark. The man beside Alara stirred, his body tensing. He didn't release her, but shifted slightly, placing himself more fully between her and the newcomers. A low growl started in his chest. "What do you want?" His voice was flat, cold, and heavy with menace. Garrock puffed out his chest, trying to project an authority he clearly didn't feel. "We've come for the Omega." She deserted her duties. "She is not going anywhere," the stranger stated. It wasn't a debate. It was an unbreakable law. Lyra laughed, a high, sharp sound. "You have no say in the matter, lone wolf. She belongs to the Blackwood Pack. She belongs to us." The stranger, Cale, turned his head just enough to look down at Alara. His golden eyes were questioning. Was this her pack? Were these her people? She could only give a tiny, terrified shake of her head. They were her captors, her tormentors, not her people. His gaze hardened as he turned back to them. "She belongs to me." Garrock saw his opportunity. This stranger was powerful, yes, but he was alone, and Garrock had ambition. He had been making quiet overtures to a rival power, a shadowy faction known as the Ember Covenant, who promised strength to those who would help them unseat the old powers. A female with a fresh claiming mark from a powerful, unknown shifter. She would be a valuable prize, a key to earning favor with his new masters. "She comes with us," Garrock snarled, and he and two other warriors who had been lurking behind him charged into the cave. The man, Cale, moved with a speed that was breathtaking. He was on his feet, shoving Alara behind him before they had taken 2 steps. He was still weak from his injuries, she realized with a pang of fear. He met their charge with a roar that was more beast than man, a sound of pure fury that shook the very rock around them. He fought like a storm, a whirlwind of controlled violence. He was unarmed and unarmored, but his hands were like hammers, his grace that of a predator. He broke one warrior's arm with a sickening crack and sent another flying out of the cave with a powerful kick. But he was outnumbered, and his movements were a fraction too slow. The wound on his side, the one she had tended, had reopened. Blood stained his skin. Garak was a cunning fighter. While Kale was occupied with the others, he lunged, not for the man, but for Alara. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like claws. She cried out, a sound of pain and fear. Hearing her cry, Kale faltered. His head whipped around, his golden eyes blazing with a terrifying light. That moment of distraction was all Garak's remaining warrior needed. He slammed the hilt of his axe into the back of Kale's head. Kale staggered, a grunt of pain forced from his lips. He dropped to one knee, shaking his head as if to clear it. Before he could recover, Garak was dragging Alara out of the cave. "No!" she screamed, struggling against his iron grip. She reached a hand out toward Kale, her heart feeling like it was being ripped from her chest. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, his filled with a helpless, primal rage, hers with utter despair. Garak didn't take her back to the pack. He dragged her through the snow in a different direction, toward the dark, jagged peaks that bordered their territory, the lands of the Ember Covenant. Lyra followed, a triumphant smirk on her face. "You see, Ghost?" Lyra said, leaning close to Alara's ear. "No matter who you find, no matter what pathetic little fantasy you cook up, you will always be ours to control. You will always be worthless." The words hit her like stones, shattering the fragile hope that had begun to grow in the cave. Lyra was right. What was she? A marked Omega? A plaything for powers she couldn't comprehend. The warmth she had felt in the stranger's arms felt like a distant dream, a cruel joke. They chained her in silver. The metal burned her skin where it touched, a cold fire that seemed to suck the very life from her. Worse, it seemed to sever the connection she had felt to the stranger. The warmth of the bond, that hum of rightness, was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching void. It was a physical pain, a soul-deep loneliness that was worse than any beating she had ever endured. Garak presented her to his master, a tall, gaunt shifter named Malphus. His eyes were like chips of obsidian, and a cruel, knowing smile played on his lips. He was the leader of the Ember Covenant, a self-proclaimed Shadow King. Malphus circled her like a vulture, his gaze lingering on the mark on her wrist. "Remarkable," he mused, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Garak, you have done well. You did not know it, but you have brought me the one thing I needed most." He leaned in close, his breath cold and foul. "You see, little Omega, that blizzard was my creation, a trap, a lure for a very specific prey, the Alpha King, Kale. For centuries he has ruled, untouchable, but even kings have weaknesses." Alpha King, Kale. The name echoed in the hollow space inside her. The stranger in the cave, the man who had claimed her, was the supreme leader of all shifters, the most powerful being in their world. And she, a worthless Omega, was his mate. The idea was so preposterous it bordered on madness. "He was wounded, looking for a place to shelter from my storm," Malphus continued, his eyes glittering with dark glee. "And he stumbled right into the arms of his own fated mate. Destiny has a wonderfully cruel sense of humor. He has searched for you for centuries, his one true weakness, and finds you just in time for me to use you against him. Malphus gestured to a dark altar in the center of the chamber. We are going to perform a ritual, a severing. By using you, his other half, as a conduit, I will not just break your bond. I will drain his power, his very life force, and take it for myself. You, little Omega, will be the key to my ascension, a perfect, empty vessel for my triumph. Despair washed over her, a black, suffocating tide. Empty vessel, worthless. The words of her pack, of Lyra, now echoed in the mouth of this monster. It was her curse. It was all she would ever be. She was chained to an altar, a tool to be used in the destruction of the one person who had ever shown her an ounce of kindness, the man who was her mate. Tears streamed down her face, silent tracks of misery. She was going to be the death of him. Her worthless life would end in causing the ruin of a king. It was a fate more cruel than she could have ever imagined. She closed her eyes, sinking into the abyss of her own hopelessness. The cold of the silver chains and the stone altar seeped into her, chilling her to the soul. It was over. And then, in the deepest, darkest part of that despair, she felt it. A flicker. A tiny spark in the void where the bond had been. It was faint, distant, but it was there. It was him. Hold on. The thought was not her own. It was a whisper in her mind, a thread of warmth in the suffocating cold. It was his voice, his will, reaching across the distance, through the dampening effect of the silver. I am coming. The promise was a lifeline. It was impossible, insane, but she clung to it. The tiny ember of defiance that had refused to be extinguished in the snow, in the face of Lyra's cruelty, flickered once more. It was not dead. She would hold on. The ritual began. Malphus's followers chanted in a guttural tongue, their voices weaving a net of dark energy around the chamber. Malphus stood before her, holding a black obsidian knife. He raised it high, the tip gleaming in the torchlight. "Let the age of shadow begin," he cried. At that exact moment, the entire fortress shook. A deafening crash echoed from the main gates, a sound of splintering wood and shattering stone. The chanting faltered. Screams of alarm replaced the dark hymns. Malphus's head snapped toward the entrance, his face a mask of fury. He's here. And then he was. Cale exploded into the chamber, not through the door, but through the wall itself. Rock and mortar burst inward as he smashed his way through, a primal force of absolute, unrestrained rage. He was no longer the wounded stranger from the cave. He was fully healed, clad in black armor, and at his back were the elite warriors of his royal guard. His eyes, pure, burning gold, scanned the room and found her instantly. The rage in them was a terrifying sight, a fire that promised to burn his enemies to ash. But when his gaze met hers, she saw something else beneath the fury, a raw, desperate fear. The fear of losing her. The battle was immediate and brutal. Cale's guard engaged the Ember Covenant, the clash of steel and the snarls of shifting wolves filling the air. Cale himself moved like a phantom, a blur of black armor and death, cutting a straight path through the chaos toward the altar. Toward her. Malphus, seeing his prize about to be snatched away, panicked. His plan was crumbling. He abandoned the ritual and turned on Alara, his face twisted with spite. If he couldn't have the king's power, he would take the king's heart. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back, and pressed the cold obsidian blade to her throat. "One more step, and she dies," Malphus screamed, his voice shrill over the din of battle. Cale froze. He was 10 feet away, a path of broken bodies behind him. The sight of the blade at her throat, of the single bead of blood that welled up where it touched her skin, seemed to break something inside him. A raw, agonized sound was torn from his chest. Seeing Cale helpless, seeing the man who called her mine brought to his knees by a threat to her life, ignited something in Alara. All the years of pain, of being called worthless, of being treated like dirt, coalesced with the terror of the moment and the fierce, protective love she suddenly felt for this man. It was a maelstrom inside her soul, and it erupted. It was not a sound. It was not a feeling. It was light. A blinding, pure white light that exploded from her core, shattering the silver chains as if they were glass. It was not a fire that burned, but a wave of pure life, of radiant warmth. It slammed into Malphus, throwing him back against the far wall. The obsidian knife, a thing of shadow and death, dissolved into dust in its path. The light washed over the entire chamber. Cale's warriors felt their wounds closing, their strength renewed. The shadow creatures of the Covenant shrieked as the light touched them, their dark forms sizzling and dissolving like smoke in the sun. Alara stood, untethered, the center of a nova of incandescent power. She felt the bond with Cale snap back into place, not as a thread, but as a brilliant, unbreakable cable of light and energy, 1,000 times stronger than before. She felt his awe, his shock, his overwhelming love pouring into her. She was not a soul healer. She was a life bringer. The ultimate antithesis to Malphus's shadow and decay. Malphus struggled to his feet, his skin blistered, his power shattered by her radiance. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror. What are you?" he rasped. Alara looked at him, her eyes glowing with a soft silver light that matched the mark on her wrist. All her fear was gone, burned away by the fire of her own unleashed power. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, ringing with an authority she had never known. "I am not worthless," she declared. "I am not an empty vessel." She raised a hand, and the light around her intensified, focusing on Cale, pouring into him, lending him her strength. He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a love so profound it made her heart ache. He gave her a sharp, predatory smile, a look that promised utter devastation for their enemy. He didn't need to be told twice. With a roar, he launched himself at the weakened Malphus. The final confrontation was short and absolute. The Shadow King stood no chance against the Alpha King, who was now bolstered by the full, untamed power of his mate. When it was over, silence fell upon the chamber, broken only by the panting breaths of the victorious warriors. Malphus was gone, his dark covenant shattered. Cale stood over the spot where his enemy had fallen for a moment before turning. He ignored the bows of his men, his eyes fixed only on her. He walked to her, his steps slow and deliberate, as if approaching something sacred. The inferno of his battle rage was gone, replaced by a look of tender reverence. He stopped before her, reaching out a hand, not to touch her, but hovering just over the mark on her wrist. "Alara." He breathed her name, the first time she had heard him say it. It sounded like a prayer. "You are my queen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He finally lowered his hand, his calloused fingers gently tracing the silver lines of the wolf and moon. more powerful, and more magnificent than I could have ever dreamed. She met his gaze, her own power receding, leaving her feeling tired but whole. For the first time, she did not flinch from his intensity. She did not feel the crushing weight of her own inadequacy. He did not see an Omega. He saw a queen. And in the reflection of his golden eyes, she started to see it too. With a courage she never knew she possessed, she reached up and placed her hand over his heart. "And you are my king," she whispered. As her words faded, a brilliant light flared where her hand rested. Kael gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and when the light subsided, a new mark was burned into the black leather of his armor, right over his heart. It was a perfect match to the one on her wrist. The bond was complete, a two-way current of power and love. She had claimed him, just as he had claimed her. He pulled her into his arms then, crushing her against his chest in an embrace that was fierce and protective and everything she had ever craved. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the tremors running through his massive frame. The ancient, lonely king had finally found his other half. Later, he stood with her on the battlements of his own citadel, a towering mountain fortress that made the Blackwood Pack's lodge look like a hovel. His royal guard and his people were assembled in the courtyard below, a sea of loyal faces turned up toward them. Kael kept her hand clasped tightly in his arm a warm, solid presence at her back. He presented her to them, his voice booming with pride and power, echoing across the stone. "Behold," he roared, "your queen, Elara, my mate, the light of our people, who shattered the shadows of the covenant." A cheer went up from the crowd, a thunderous roar of approval and welcome that vibrated through the stone beneath her feet. They were not cheering for an Omega. They were cheering for their queen. For her. She looked out at them, at the hundreds of faces filled with awe and respect. She looked at the sprawling, beautiful kingdom that was now her home. And she looked at the magnificent, powerful man beside her, whose golden eyes held nothing but adoration for her. The ghost was gone. The worthless Omega was a memory. In their place stood a queen, a life-bringer, a beloved mate. She was home. And as Kael leaned down to kiss her, a soft, promising kiss that sealed their new beginning, she knew with absolute certainty that she would never be cold or alone again. The ember had become an inferno.